Good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to this webinar on legitimacy and solidarity in the euro area. We have an excellent panel of speakers to discuss this topic. Let me briefly introduce each of them. We have Chris Lord, is professor at ARENA, Center for European Studies at University of Oslo. Welcome, Chris. Joris Melman is a PhD candidate at ARENA, the Center for European Studies at University of Oslo as well. Very welcome, Joris. And then Waltraud Schelkle, she's professor of political economy at the European Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science in London. Welcome, Waltraud. And last but not least, Johannes Lindner is the head of EU Institutions and Foreign Division in the Directorate General of International and European Relations at the ECB. Welcome, Johannes. Let me briefly say that the idea of this webinar came from a project. This is in fact part of the activities of the PLATO project, which is a project investigating the post-crisis legitimacy in the EU. Without further ado, I leave the floor to Chris and ask him to maybe to say a few things about the project and then to share with us some insights about legitimacy in Europe. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you everyone for joining us. I will indeed just very, very briefly introduce the PLATO project and then say some extremely general things about financial solidarity. The PLATO project is a Marie Curie funded network. We are 15 PhD students in 8 European universities. All have been working together on the question of whether the European Union has experienced a legitimacy crisis. We have a report series, we have policy briefs, we have a blog, we have 12 training partners, SEPS is one of them. We've written a book together. We've tried to develop our own, and I think very European way of researching a PhD, not as a kind of solitary experience, but as a network of researchers who move. Now, going on to legitimacy crisis, you know, we may see legitimacy crises as happening when political systems can't satisfy all the necessary conditions for their own legitimacy simultaneously. So it may be difficult for them to satisfy all of the conditions for democratic legitimacy. It might be difficult for the European Union to be legitimate with all its member states at the same time. It might be difficult for it to have output legitimacy and input legitimacy at the same time. Now, given that political systems regulate relationships between all other systems, we might expect political systems to be especially vulnerable to problems that are displaced, crises that are displaced from other political systems, from other kinds of system, I should say. So, for example, banks fail and political systems then have to pick up the pieces. I think I'm going to have to move on the next slide. We should be on to the next slide, if that's okay. And the next one after that. Very good, thank you very much. And then, of course, the European Union might be especially vulnerable to legitimacy crises. Legitimacy crises displaced from its own member states into the Union. Legitimacy crises displaced from other kinds of political system into the European Union. Perhaps the migration crisis is an example of that one. Now, looking at the 15 PhD projects, I think they've taught me 2 different things. First, they've told me a lot about the different ways in which the Union can manage legitimacy problems so that they don't actually turn into legitimacy crises. So they kind of just simmer beneath the point at which they become full-blown legitimacy crises. And the other thing I think the 15 projects have taught me is that we're only beginning to understand the huge variety of ways in which the EU exercises political power in ways that need legitimacy. Next slide, please. So does that mean everything is okay? I don't think so. I don't think so. Let's take monetary union as an example. Again, let's move on to the next slide, please, after that one. Any one way of structuring monetary union preempts other ways in which the political economy of Europe could have been structured. So that is an exercise in political power that requires legitimacy. Nor can a monetary union avoid problems of justice. Rawls defined justice as how well the overall structure of laws and economic and social opportunities all fit together to form a more or less fair scheme of cooperation, as he puts it. Now, surely the European Union and its single currency have a huge influence on how the overall structure of laws and public policy under which people live their lives work out for them. And I think that is what is missing. Understanding that is what is missing from the debate about financial solidarity. I worries about a transfer union. I think in many ways it's a straw man. I, on the other hand, love ideas about pooling risk, insurance and reinsurance. Yet it seems to me that all of these things, discussions of transfer unions and risk pooling, insurance and all of the rest of it, tend to miss the basic point that making laws together, making public policies together, presupposes some kind of a mutual understanding of the effects of those laws and those public policies on the individual lives of all of the people who are affected by them. So what I'm trying to get at, I think, is something like this. We need, as it were, cognitive solidarity, a solidarity of understanding before we even get to financial solidarity. We need a kind of cognitive solidarity before we can even define what financial solidarity requires of us. Here, I think our 15 PhD projects can actually help once again. Each of them is its own strange little insight into how different actors make sense of the legitimacy problems of developing institutions, laws, rules, and so on at the European level. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Chris, for this very interesting introduction. Let me now move to Joris. Joris is one of the 15 PhD students, candidates that Chris mentioned earlier. And one of the aspects on which Joris worked is the role of public opinion in relation to legitimacy, which I think it's quite an important point. So I now give the floor to Joris to share with us the insights from his research.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you, Chris, as well for the introduction. Before I begin, I noticed that I cannot share my screen because the host has disabled it. So I hope that can be fixed. Otherwise, okay. Yeah, that works now. So thank you very much again. What I would like to talk about today is not so much the need for solidarity. I will for now take it as a given that at least some solidarity is needed if the euro is to survive. What I want to discuss instead is to what extent public opinion allows for solidarity. Or to put it differently, how much space electorates give to their national governments in negotiating solidarity. Because I think it's clear that the role of the public is central here, but it's not always so clear how to really understand the role of the public. So to start with a more general background, how should we understand the role of the public in EU affairs in the first place? Well, when political scientists try to do so, they usually speak about the constraining the senses. So the idea is that ever since the 1990s, European affairs have become politicized. citizens have become more critical. As a consequence, they constrain the integration process, and national governments have to look over their shoulders constantly when negotiating European issues. And my impression, and I think of that of many commentators, is that since this summer's negotiations about the budget, but also the recovery fund, this kind of represents a next step in this process, because the role of the public has been even more pronounced and the debates have been so heated and so public. So to just briefly illustrate this, I would like to talk about the Netherlands as a case. Most of you might be familiar with it, but just to illustrate what's at stake, I think it's a useful case. Netherlands, of course, has been the leader of the Frugal Four. So together with Denmark, Austria, and Sweden, they have been taking a hard stance on solidarity against Eurobonds in the beginning, against grants, only loans, and loans only under strict conditions. Now, it is of course not new for Netherlands to be frugal. This is the normal position for Netherlands, but I think the way in which Netherlands presents itself this time is new. Because firstly, it's important to realize that most domestic experts argued against such a stance. This is Klaas Knot, the president of the Dutch Central Bank, who very publicly argued for more Dutch solidarity. Almost all prominent Dutch economists, both left and right wing, together wrote an open letter saying that the Netherlands should be more solidary. And even the most prominent lobbyist of the Netherlands, Hans de Boer, who is the president of the Employers Foundation, made similar remarks in the media. And despite all this, the Netherlands still stood to its harsh position, and did so in quite a loud and quite a blunt way, you could say. And this led to quite a strong international backlash. So Portugal, Italy, and Spain, the Netherlands was called arrogant and repulsive. Macron spoke about the Netherlands undermining the future of Europe. And even Germany, normally an ally of the Netherlands in these types of negotiations, was very critical of the Netherlands. So then the question is how to explain this positioning. And I think, of course, you can point at an interest that the Netherlands has here, and perhaps they want to gain more leverage in negotiations by beginning with a harsh stance. But I think you can also not really understand the positioning without looking at public opinion. Firstly, because the governing parties are competing with the right-wing populist parties of the PVV of Wilders and the Forum of Democracy by Thierry Baudet. So to shield them from criticism from that side, they try to show that they're protecting Dutch interest. Likewise, the Dutch media has been quite strong on the not so solidary side. So you might already have seen this cover by Elsevier, conservative tabloid in the Netherlands, because it has been going viral also in the south of Europe. It portrays the Southern European men as lazy and enjoying the good life, while Dutch people are working hard to keep the system going, which for the magazine meant we shouldn't give a cent to the South. And you also see this reflected in polls. 75% of the Dutch population supported the stance of the Frugal Four. So taking all this into account, it seems quite rational maybe for the government to take a harsh stance, because this is what the public expects of them. But this is the position I would like to challenge, because I don't think it's so sure what the public really demands from a government. To illustrate this, I would like to share some findings from my PhD research. In my PhD, I look at public opinion on the euro. And in order to do so, I have conducted a series of focus groups in different European countries. So in these focus groups or group discussions, I ask citizens to talk about the euro, but also about its underlying politics. So questions of autonomy and solidarity and these types of topics. I organized these groups in 3 different countries. So in Italy, in France, and in Netherlands. In every country, there were 3 different groups with one social group each, one with bankers, one with hairdressers, and one with structurally unemployed. Now, the advantage of such focus groups is that they give us more insight into how citizens actually perceive the euro in politics, how they talk about it, what arguments they use, and if they care about it in the first place. Of course, they don't, like surveys, tell us about how many people are in favor, how many are against, but they give us more in-depth insight into the construction of public opinions. Now, I should mention that I conducted these groups in the summer of 2019, so before the Corona crisis. I'm also still analyzing the data, but I think still the findings that can be derived from them are very relevant to understand these questions of solidarity and the influence of public opinion. So There are two types of findings that I would like to share for now. One concerned the constraints of public opinion on solidarity. The other one nuanced this claim a little bit. So to start with the first one, I think what is the constraining factor is that in the focus groups, you see very clearly that almost all people perceive European questions through a national lens. And this is perhaps not so surprising, but people talk about European affairs in terms of their national interests, not in terms of a European interest. So in the Netherlands, people are worried about having to pay for the fiscal responsibility of sovereign states and having to transfer money all the time. In Italy, people are much more supportive of solidarity and say things like, well, if a country is in trouble, the richer country should help, even though they do also understand some northern hesitance in this respect. And in France, finally, they take a more of an in-between position where there are most people in the focus groups say they think there should be more solidarity, but it seems less connected to their own perceived interests. And actually what they care about more is autonomy, actually, than solidarity. Maybe this is all not so surprising, but I think what is more surprising is, or interesting to see at least, is how this feeds into their perception of solidarity. Because in Italy, the way they speak about solidarity, it is more as if it's part of being in a community with each other. So because we share political projects with different countries, we're interdependent and we should help each other in times of need. Whereas in the Netherlands, on the other hand, helping each other is more seen as charity. So in the Dutch groups, people often compare the help to Greece to development aid to Africa. So it's not seen as solidarity, it's more seen as charity. And this brings me to the third point, and that is that in this sense, the national perception functions as a benchmark to compare or to evaluate solidarity against. So the more positive people are about their national government and the more its capabilities to create wealth, the lower is the willingness to share risk with others. So if this is indeed how it is, then these are more bleak prospects for European solidarity, perhaps. But I think there's also something that nuances this a little bit. And this is because of two related concepts, that of indifference and that of ambivalence. When you follow European politics as an expert, you might easily think the debate is so heated, it's so polarized, and everybody in the street has a strong opinion on Europe. But looking at the focus groups, this is not the case. For most people, Europe is quite a distant issue. They find it difficult to understand, it's away from them, they're not always that interested in it, and they have difficulty in linking the pieces. So it's not that they are very indifferent necessarily, but they just find it very difficult to find it, to express a clear opinion. So what you actually see in these focus groups is that it's not an exchange of pre-existing opinions, actually. It's more making sense together of how to speak about these topics in the first place. What metaphors can we use? What words can we use? And because of this, opinions are also quite unstable and can quite easily be changed, is my perception. So just as an example, in the Dutch groups, people are quite frustrated with the perceived need to transfer money to the south. But then at the end of the focus group, they are confronted with videos showing the Greek perspective, and many people easily change their minds. And they express more understanding for Greek people. And this is especially so when they use frames that frame Greek people as part of us. So for example, in the unemployed group, at some point somebody brings in the idea that these Greek people are also common men suffering from the elites that are always neglecting them. And in this sense, they are something that they share. And I think it's easier for them to express some solidarity. And I think that because of this, we should see public opinion on solidarity and European issues in general as very elite generated. And it's elites that shape public opinion to a large extent. So this is not to say that elites can just, think of an opinion and bring it onto the people, but it means that the people don't have a fixed opinion beforehand. And if they persistently give particular discourse, people will go along with that. So as a conclusion of that, then, I would say that even though public opinion is important, questions of solidarity are still mostly in the hands of elites. So of course, public opinion is a very strong force and has a very functional importance. but it is a passive force more than an active force. It's not people who put these items on the agenda very often. So this doesn't mean to say that any political actor can create the discourse they like, of course, because there are many constraints. People have already a history of information they've heard about Europe. There might of course be counter narratives from populists, for example, from Eurosceptic parties. And also because people don't have a strong opinion themselves, they might be likely to follow trusted others. So this means they will follow the party they already like in what they say. They're not likely to accept information from others. But still, it doesn't do away with the fact that it's still elites that are leading this, and publics are following the elite in this respect. So I think in the end, this means that achieving solidarity still depends on the stories that national elites are willing to tell. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thanks very much, Joris, for this very interesting presentation. I mean, if I look at my experience and the way I'm following the Italian debate, I cannot agree more with your conclusion that actually the elites should contribute to shape public opinions and narrative rather than going after it. But let's leave the comment for later. I would like to give the floor to Waltraud. I mean, Waltraud, we had a meeting in person about 3 years ago when you came to CEPS to present your book on the political economy of monetary solidarity. Chris hinted at the fact that we can look at the issue of solidarity in two ways. One is really about risk sharing in broad terms, let's put it this way, and the role of the policymakers, and on the other side, the public opinions. Now, I think one very fundamental question is to what extent these two views are complementary or alternative, or whether we can actually reconnect these two dimensions, or whether one is more important than the other. But please, your comments.
Thank you very much for this introduction, because this is exactly what I want to answer, and you didn't tell me that this would be the introduction, so that's perfect. But I see it as complementary, and I want to explain why legitimacy doesn't play that much of a role in my own research, but why I still see a lot of mileage in what Joris and Chris Lord do there. So Joris Mehlman presents a very careful analysis of legitimacy needs. You know, most scholars who have invested a lot of time in researching a concept like legitimacy and this long history of thinking about it, use it like a hammer and see nails everywhere. Joris starts with the indifference and ambivalence of voters about the EU generally and the Euro specifically. So no black and white, it's legitimate or not, and sees how the legitimacy of both can explain these attitudes of indifference and ambivalence. And then what he finds through a really interesting use of focus groups, so small groups of people that you make talk to each other, he applies treatments to them, so exposes them to different pieces of information. And what he finds is that the euro is a social fact for people, something they use and don't worry about very much as a problematic institution, except, of course, when there's a crisis. Now, this is an insight from a method that is rarely used in public opinion research, but is a valid complement of all the surveys and other public opinion research methods used. So I'm full in praise for this. I applaud Plato above all for problematizing legitimacy, or that's how I read it. In my short statement, I want to briefly explain to you, just as Cynthia just alluded to, why legitimacy does not figure prominently. In fact, in the ERC-funded research project SOLID that I convened with Maurizio Ferreira and Hans-Peter Crises, that SOLID is an acronym for Sovereignty, Solidarity and Identity in Europe post-2008. Solidarity does, however. Let me start from this finding of Joris Mehlman that the euro has become a social fact for many people, and I think it should not really surprise us. Where this is different, for example, an active minority in Germany that keeps on challenging every monetary policy instrument that the ECB announces, It is mostly driven by economics and law professors, many retired in search for some fun in old age. It is not a preoccupation of the median voter. The AfD, the party political manifestation of this minority, has since it was once preoccupied with the euro area crisis, it has gone on to the issues like anti-immigration and white supremacy, which is indirect evidence that the euro cannot sustain a political campaign. Only policies can. So taking something as a social fact is legitimacy of sorts. Hence, in answer to the question of this webinar, I would say, yes, there can be legitimacy without solidarity. But then the question is, where does that leave us with solidarity on which so much political energy is spent and should be spent in the EU? I think a lot that is captured by legitimacy can also be captured by politicization, engagement with politics, deliberation and contestation of collective decisions. Politicization also captures the interest that you take in legitimacy. Where it is absent, politics becomes volatile, extremist and unpredictable. In contrast to legitimacy, politicization translates it into political action we can experience and act upon. The politicization of policies can be exactly what you want in functioning democracies: public debate and scrutiny of what concerns us all. But this constructive politicization can easily turn into the politicization of the polity itself, questioning its very foundations, the boundaries of a community, its binding authority, and the bonds of risk sharing and solidarity. This is what Solid is about. The multiple crises of the last decade provide ample evidence for this destructive form of politicization. Brexit questions the boundaries of the EU, which have been fluid for entrance, but not for exit. And Roger Ferreira maintains that this cannot be the case in anything like a federal polity. In the ongoing refugee crisis, some member state governments have openly questioned the binding authority of qualified majority decisions. And in the euro area crisis, which is my research interest, even a minimalist amount of solidarity with member states that became victims of market panic was deeply contested. The politicization of risk sharing then was not at all helpful for supporting citizens in dire straits. Again, something I like about the term politicization: while you can never have too much legitimacy, you can have too much politicization. The term also helps us to understand the difference between the crisis politics of the euro area crisis and the pandemic. Fiscal financial solidarity in the form of emergency loans to governments that were shut out of bond markets was so politicized that only harsh conditionality, that is, limits on the extent of risk sharing, could get the Troika program through the Council and the German Parliament. In the countries thus supported, it left an impression of undeserved punishment, even though other member states had underwritten the biggest bailouts in the history of sovereign lending and borrowing. In Italy, it made the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, so toxic that it became unusable as a first response to the corona pandemic. So the difference between solidarity then, the euro area crisis, and now the COVID-19 pandemic is hard to grasp in terms of legitimacy, I think. The inauspicious start of managing the pandemic when no member state responded to Italy's call for help, which was excruciating to watch, did not raise the legitimacy of the EU. The proposals for a corona bond or a recovery fund were, if anything, more hastily put together by executives than the European Stability Mechanism. It was the form of politicization that made the difference. In the crisis politics of the pandemic, the conditions of solidarity were contested: grants or loans, conditionality or earmarking for public health purposes, not the need for solidarity itself. This had certainly to do with the position of Chancellor Merkel, who was interested in avoiding a divisive conflict, but also in getting the corona bond proposal off the table. But there was also the tangible experience of solidarity itself. And Chris, I think it needs that experience. One can't have an understanding before one has an experience. A pandemic even if it does not hurt everybody equally, is something voters can empathize with. The EU could immediately demonstrate that it can lead the crucial coordinating role of a weak centre that threatens nobody, while left to the member states, there would be less solidarity forthcoming than everybody wanted. In short, I think the EU must work on creating loyalty through risk sharing and solidarity. Legitimacy will follow, and even if it doesn't follow, solidarity has done some good in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Waltraud, for your comments. I think Joris and Chris will have the opportunity to react to your comments. Let me now move to Johannes. I actually realized that we barely mentioned the ECB. We spoke about the euro area, the legitimacy, but I think that the ECB was never mentioned. And in fact, it is at the core of when we talk about the euro and the euro area. And on this, I think, the issue of legitimacy has been considered always very important by the ECB, especially after the financial crisis. I'm an economist. I have to apologize with most of you. So for me, actually, legitimacy is something that you gain through what you're able to deliver. I'm very much driven by output legitimacy, which I think it worked quite well until the financial crisis. And then actually everything started to change, and we realized actually how the issue of legitimacy is actually complex. And maybe just allow me for another comment. About 1 year ago, my colleagues started to look at the way that the ECB communicates. And there has been a substantial change in it. The ECB has a Twitter account where basically there is an attempt to explain key facts and key initiatives that the ECB is undertaking to the general people. This is something that actually didn't exist before. So we also realized that the ECB was trending in Twitter in a certain specific moment, but also that the ECB listens. So these are actually examples of how the approach, if you want, to the broad issue of legitimacy has evolved over time, and these attempt to reach out mostly to the general public. So in a sense, we go to what Joris was talking about, and the role also of public opinion, and how actually you can get the support of people. But okay, let me stop it here. I find this actually quite fascinating, but I would like to give Johannes the opportunity to comment and also to share his views. Thanks.
Cynthia, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I mean, I want to make 3 points. The first is more a caveat, and then 2 points. The first is that, and that's maybe a bit of a reply to Chris, I mean, I've now worked for the ECB for 17 years, and often you were in the room with the privileged of the one with a long-term perspective and a sort of federal vision, if I may, because you were not sent from a national capital, you were not in the kind of short-term political constraints and some of the ideas that went into the 4 presidents report, the 5 presidents report, were of course also in a way looking ahead with the hope that it wouldn't be kind of assessed only from a national lens. And of course, sometimes there is a frustration to see how when you're in a national capital and then in another national capitals, these 2 discourses are quite disjunct. But I feel, and I think I'm not doing it for just professional reasons, I want to strike with my 2 main points a positive message. One is a more empirical one on the fact that the euro is really, as Joris says, above the fray, and I want to demonstrate this with the recent research that we did at the ECB. And the second is and I try to keep it very brief there, is how I think from an EMU and EU architecture we do see a learning process, maybe a bit what along the lines that Waltraud explained, a learning process whereby we have addressed by and by gradually some of the design flaws that we thought we get by with at the injection of the euro. And so, starting with my first point, so the euro actually enjoying, as shortly before the COVID crisis, because Eurobarometer data has not been released since then, the euro was as popular in terms of support for the euro as ever. So, and even through the crisis, we have seen that that in fact the euro's support for the euro has been relatively constant. Of course, what we've also seen is that salience of EMU has become much higher. And here I think that's something that, contrast to the Eurobarometer, Joy's very good work with focus groups can pick up much better than the Eurobarometer, where we just simply have the data on support for the euro. Okay, we have a bit of a sense of don't knows go a bit less down. People are a bit more pronounced in their positions. But in that respect, it's good to draw in a bit more. So we've seen a relatively constant support for the euro, which dipped in the crisis only a little bit. But what is interesting is that the support or trust in the ECB has gone down quite significantly. And to sort of explain the gap between the ECB support and the euro support, there are colleagues of mine have done some research. In fact, one of my colleagues that is a co-author, Stephanie Bergbauer, is also dialed in here. And if you want to check out the article that they wrote, is in the Economic Bulletin article, Economic Bulletin of June 2020. And in trying to understand better why the euro has been constant or less affected by the crisis, and the ECB's trust has been more affected, they in fact have distinguished between sort of 3 or 4 groups of people. Sort of those people that support the euro are skeptical towards the ECB. These are the ECB skeptics. And those people, then those people that are, and that's in a way the most interesting one, people that are pro-euro, but critical towards the ECB. Then you have the 2 classic ones, which are pro-EMU, EMU supporters, pro-ECB, and those that are anti-ECB, anti-euro. And then there are a few ones, which I don't want to go into a bit more, but they are interesting to look at as well, that are pro-ECB, but anti-euro. What we call the Eurosceptics, which is partly because they think maybe EU institutions do a good job, but the euro is a bad idea, or they generally are pro-institutions, even in the national context, but they just think European integration, euro integration was wrong. Now, if you look a bit closer of the factors that influence support, in particular for the ECB, but also for the euro, you do have distinct national differences. That's true. So there is national differences that play a role, but you also have a strong economic dimension, and this economic dimension is linked to how the crisis is perceived, and that economic perception is not uniform across a nation. So they have done a bit of interesting research that also showed that there are sometimes sub-national, so regional differences among support for the euro or support for or trust in the ECB, which I think is an interesting finding. And in the way that the ECB support for the ECB is sort of reacting, you also see how really the economic crisis has panned out. So, for example, in the German case, some of the ECB criticism comes when really the low interest rate policy is taking ground. So there you see sort of a reaction towards ECB policy kicking in. You have in Greece a mixture between sort of slightly dropping support for the euro, which is a general sense of that they have not, that they have not been benefiting from the euro, and that this is essentially an economic crisis. So in that respect, the kind of the euro associated with the economy has been felt. But you also see, because of the Troika involvement, some criticism towards the ECB. You also see that people that have generally a more positive perspective on the economy, regardless of the national attribute, are more likely to be supportive for the ECB and the euro. So, I mean, it's definitely worth looking at these research results a bit more closely. But what I would say we can draw from it is first this positive point that also Joris found, that in a way, although of course in an economic crisis, economic fundamentals are questioned, and some people have said, why is the euro there? Do we really benefit? But overall, in general, it seems that the euro is not questioned, even in a deep economic crisis. And I mean, we can drill down, I mean, Cynthia, on Italy, where the picture to some extent at some periods have been slightly different, but still, I would say that is a cross-national, cross-euro area phenomenon. And then the second is that the ECB has suffered in terms of trust. But I would say that is not, I mean, that's not so surprising in a crisis, that there's been a very deep economic crisis. And you also see that in a way, the ECB is bouncing back. And it tries to address some of this kind of lost trust by trying to gain that trust back. And there are of course, two elements that how that can be done. One is the classic, what you said, Cynthia, is the output legitimacy, is by doing the economic policy or the monetary policy that is relevant, and thereby by influencing sort of economic factors. And I think and you see also the positive effect in the way, at least you see that the picking up. But of course, there are also elements which are outside of the ECB's control. And here, a key element is the unique setup of the EU, namely that you need fiscal policy to support. And you hear the ECB saying, look, fiscal policy needs to support. And we see now in the current crisis, in fact, fiscal policy is jumping to the support. So there's this kind of output legitimacy that we can partly control ourselves, and we see a positive effect of that. And partly, of course, it's also related to the impact of other actors. And then the second point, which has also been mentioned already, is communication. And again, communication where you need to try to explain why the things you're doing are in fact addressing some of the problems that are perceived. But there, and that goes a bit in the direction also what Joris has already lined out, it is again the unique setup of how in a multicultural, multi-language kind of setup can you as an ECB kind of come into these national discourses. And I think we have quite positive examples, but we also have examples where we've maybe not been able to fully reach out. Of course, the national central bank play an important role here as well. But that is I mean, that is a bit of the kind of outside of the I mean, we have to adjust to that, but it's partly also outside of the possibility of what we can change, where we have an influence. But we can try as much as possible with our communication to bring across why we're doing this policy. Now, I'm conscious of the time, but let me quickly do the second point. Is that okay? My second point is along and around this unique setup. And here I would say, I would like to make the point that that I think has been kind of a learning taking place, a learning that we've seen in two crises. And I would say the second crisis is still panning out in the way of how much do we do a learning. The first is, I think that we have painfully had to painfully concede that this Maastricht setup with the small e and a large M or capital M has been one that was probably not fit for purpose. So this kind of notion that a loose coordination of policies at national level would be sufficient and that the single market would bring about all the necessary integration by itself has basically been proven wrong. And I think the reason for that design was also because it was, I mean, there was a normative theory around it that in a way said, okay, this is possible, this will be done by itself. And that's why an independent central bank and no bailout clause and no monetary financing will be kind of the safeguards around it. But at the same time, I think it was also convenient not to speak about what do we do in a crisis. So what is the role of fiscal policy in a crisis? And I think that we have been painfully learning. Now, I think that we have made great jumps in the immediate time after the financial and the euro crisis, banking union being most importantly. But I mean, we have had discussion in CEPS, quite many discussions on that this kind of learning was incomplete, and especially on the issue of stabilization and the role of fiscal. I think much of the discussions in 14, 15, 16 was representing that we were not completely learning the lessons. But here I find the second, so the current COVID crisis, very interesting, because it addresses also another dimension that wasn't so much addressed in the previous crisis, which is this distinction between EU and euro area. So much of the crisis response that we did previously was a euro area one, and it was also in the quirkiness of euro area institutional responses, the ESM and intergovernmental setup, because it was only for the euro area. And I think one of maybe the two key features of the crisis response now was that it was EU, using the EU budget in a fully supranational setup, and that it was so innovative and so big, which was also, and that goes in the direction of what Waltraud said, in the way that this time round the crisis was perceived as something which was exogenous, and not as something where you had partly wronged yourself as a member state, and therefore the kind of discourse around the crisis was much more difficult. So the nature of the crisis was different, and the learning was also bringing back, in a way, the discussion on fiscal architecture into the EU frame. Something, by the way, and that speaks to Chris a bit, something where the term transfer union was less banned, because we always had the EU budget, we always had structural funds. So that's it's something that is although limited in space, but is something that the EU was actually founded on. So here I stop, and sorry for being longer.
Thank you very much, Johannes. Before I give back the floor to Joris and then Chris, maybe to respond to some of the comments, I would like to invite everyone to ask questions. There are already a few. The way to do this is through the Q&A function. Everyone can find at the bottom of the screen a small icon, Q&A. You can open it and type in questions, and then I will pass them to our panelists. But let me give Joris first the opportunity to react to the comments made by Waltraud and Johannes.
Right, well, thank you for those very interesting comments. And I have a lot of separate points, so I'll see if I can make it a bit coherent. Maybe to start with what Johannes said about the gap between ECB trust and Euro support. Because I think, judging from my focus groups, I have a hunch what could also explain it. And of course, it's not, I cannot really prove these claims, but this is just a hunch that I think is relevant. And is that for many people, because of the complexity of the EU, they don't really link the ECB to the Euro in the first place. So in the groups, there's actually quite a lot of people that don't know what the ECB is in the first place, and they don't even know who Draghi was. And I showed videos of Draghi, they didn't know who he was. So then the one question you can ask is, what does it mean if they trust the ECB or not? And I think if you compare it to the Euro for people in the first place is a practical object to use in their daily lives, and they link it to maybe inflation or to easier traveling, but very daily life kind of things. And they have lots of difficulty in seeing how it relates to, for example, solidarity or autonomy or these types of questions. So in that sense, I would think that the Euro is kind of its own category, and the ECB is more, well, people there, if they get a survey question, they just tick the box that they use for all the other trust questions. So Commission, Central Bank, they probably use the same one, so to say. So I'm pretty sure you can see a correlation between trust in the Commission and the ECB, not so much with the support for the Euro. So, yeah, but I guess you need more survey research to prove this, but I think, judging from my focus groups, this is a relevant notion coming from the idea of indifference and the difficulty people have in making sense of it. Well, maybe then to stick with indifference and what Waltraud said about the link with legitimacy and politicization. Yeah, I think you mentioned something important there, and that is that politicization can be good, but it's bad if it questions the polity itself. If policies are politicized, that can be a good thing, but if the whole polity is directly questioned, it will just decrease the legitimacy of the polity. And I think this is the consequence of the indifference, is that on the one hand, it's more difficult to politicize people or to make the EU politicized among the general public. At the same time, as soon as European matters are discussed, it's it's about the EU and maybe should we leave the euro, should we leave the EU? And this is the two-sided face of indifference, that it leads to illegitimacy when it's not when people are not discussing it much, but when something gets politicized strongly, then it's a big danger, because people are also not attached to the EU in that sense. There's no diffuse support that protects the EU from superficial criticism. Then maybe on how the current crisis might be different than the previous crisis, and on whether the exogenous nature of the crisis makes things different. My personal perception is that, especially in the beginning of this crisis, this was a very useful frame. Also, when I see the Dutch debate, which I follow most closely, there definitely was some solidarity because of that, or a perception that we should help the sovereign states because of their bad luck, so to say. But I think in a few months that did change, and then when the debate went more into, hey, but why don't we have the same problems in our budget? That is because we've been fiscally responsible. And so I think I'm not sure how long this effect will last. So that's something I think will be tricky for the future. I think these are my first responses.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris, would you like to react to some of the comments? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you very much for the comments. It was a fascinating discussion. I think I'm going to pick up Waltraud's wonderful observation that you can't have understanding until you have experience. And I guess two things on that. One is that that in a way is why Johannes is also right, that learning is often incomplete, right? So it's only those things that you have experienced that give you understanding. But I think a second response is, I agree. And I think, by the way, Joris's research is a wonderful confirmation of how you can only have understanding if you have also had experience. But that does not remove the need for us occasionally to drop the big abstract philosophical questions into the debate. If we are going to have a kind of fully justified form of political power, we do have to go back to the very big abstract philosophical questions. And here are my favorite two. One which I mentioned in the introduction: how can you have a fair scheme of cooperation? How can you have a just scheme of cooperation? And my second one, which I didn't make so much of, is how can you create a democracy of democracies that share a single currency? Thank you.
Johannes, do you want to react quickly to any of these questions, or otherwise we go back to the flow?
Maybe just very quickly. I think where I'm fully with Chris, the concept of democracies cannot work. I mean, this is the concept of an international organization where essentially you do no redistribution. The moment you go, at least temporarily, away from a Pareto optimal or Pareto improving decisions, it is more difficult. The moment you go to QMV, and that's also how European integration in a way moved on, is the time when you need to have, and when the call for a direct supranational source of legitimacy, i.e. the European Parliament, has become the strongest, because you need to counterbalance the loss of direct kind of veto power of an individual member state or an individual national parliament. Of course, the other element that counterbalances this QMV is the output legitimacy, that you say, okay, you improve the output of the organization. But I think I agree with you. You cannot share a currency purely on the democracy of democracy concept.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now taking the questions that we are receiving through the Q&A function. I'm combining two comments / questions, which I would say are for Joris about the Dutch case. So there were two comments. The first one basically pointing to the fact that maybe what is missing in the Dutch debate is the fact that there is not enough explaining to people how the Netherlands became prosperous country since the creation of the euro, and let's say in the last decades. So maybe this is something that should be more part of the debate. And there was a second question, which to some extent is referring to the fact that basically in last months and also in the context of the MFF negotiations, that the fact that the Netherlands is the host of a number of, let's say, companies which are not really productive companies, but mostly the opportunity for tax avoidance is basically benefiting the Netherlands a lot, and a lot of people are speaking about this. So in a sense, both questions point to the fact that there are other elements which are missing in the public debate, which could be used to rebalance the debate. So maybe your take on these 2 points.
Yeah, so actually I really agree with especially that first comment mentioning that what is lacking is good information in that sense, and it is linked precisely, I think, because of two arguments I'm making. So the discourse that the Dutch are hearing is quite one-sided. It's very transactional. It's always about we are paying, how much are we getting? And it's very much about how how the Dutch are well behaving in a fiscal sense and other countries are not. And I think the difficulty is that there's not only national elites themselves and mostly governing parties and the media have a way to address this. But especially for national governments, it's more attractive usually to tell a different story. As you see now in the negotiations of this summer, it was simply electorally more attractive to leaders to tell a story in which a hard stance was well deserved for the southern countries. So I think this is the difficulty. I agree that there should be probably better education on this, but it's very difficult to see how this can be done if national parties don't have a strong incentive to do so. And to the second one, whether the tax evasion in the Netherlands was part of the Dutch debate. Well, I actually I wrote some op-eds myself where I tried to mention this. For the rest, I think some people know about this, but they feel it's very minor compared to the amount of money that has to be transferred to the South. So I think this is the way it's perceived in the Dutch debate. Okay.
Let me now move to two other questions which I would like to address to Johannes. The first one is also about education in a sense, and whether the role of the euro and what it represents should be more part of the debate in a positive way, including being part, for instance, of education systems more than it is now. Whether do you think this is something that actually could help the support for the euro and maybe also for the ECB? And then I will start with this and then I will move to the second one for you.
No, on this one, I would support, I mean, just to give you a quick example on that, when we introduced the new banknotes, the label under which we did it was Stronger Together, which in principle, you would wonder why the new banknotes, you call it Stronger Together, rather than safe and robust or something that would be on the fact that these are good new banknotes, but it was Stronger Together. So it was used as an opportunity to say, look, this new 20 euro bill that you have, it symbolized a notion, and that is Stronger Together. And I think that was an attempt to, in fact, combine the symbolic value that people have with the euro with the kind of more transactional act of replacing old bills with new ones.
Thank you very much. Then there is a second question, which is linked to the comments you made about the learning from the crisis. And the question is, do you think that learning from the crisis will take us closer to a fiscal union? And do you think, are we still far from it?
Look, I mean, okay, there are different perspectives. I think from a very personal perspective, with a pro-European head-on, I would say fiscal union is desirable, and also there are good economic reasons why we should move towards a fiscal union. The discourse we had previously in the EMU crisis was around how much fiscal union is needed for a resilient and stable EMU. And I think some of the discussions we had there about the stabilization instrument would have made us more stable, and I think would have also worked. But what the current crisis provides as an opportunity, and that's why I said that linking it with the EU is a chance of addressing this issue of some fiscal stabilization instruments needs to be in place for an EMU, is that you link it more to the question of what do we want to do together as a union, which policies do we want to do together as a union. Now, the current RRF, this Resolution and Recovery Facility, is set up relatively national. So you get European money to do the national recovery. So it's a bit more the insurance kind of type. But at the same time, and this I think is also a chance to win over some of the critical voices maybe in the Netherlands and elsewhere, it's linked to certain modernization objectives and targets, meaning you need to be using it partly for climate, you need to use it for digital. And I think in a way that could unleash a discourse of whether we shouldn't do much of the climate policy with European money and European regulation. And that would move us more towards a fiscal union in the sense that we would be thinking some of the tasks that currently are nationally done should in fact be done at the EU level. And probably if it's done at the EU level and beyond the one-off debt issuance, we could underline it with a own resource. This is the discussion that we currently have, which is a new debate, which has the potential to also move us a bit closer to a fiscal union. So in that respect, I would say, if the EU as a whole decides to do more at the European level, then that would have a very positive effect also on EMU, because we wouldn't have to have a sort of design of a stabilization instrument, but we would have policies that have a fiscal dimension at the European level that would have a spillover, that they have a less pro-cyclical effect that we see at the national level, and could have also stabilizing the EMU. So that would be my take on this question of fiscal union.
Thanks very much. Waltraud, would you like to step in on this topic?
Yeah, I would like very much, because it also relates to something that Chris has said. You know, we sometimes have to ask these big questions. What would be, how can we have a fair mechanism for all? And he frames it in terms of also fair representation of this. Earlier, Johannes had talked about the finding by Joris that, the fact that the euro is accepted. He interpreted it as permissive consensus. And I feel both the way of asking these big questions for a general fair mechanism, even if it's only at the level of representation, and this tendency to interpret silence as permissive consensus is unwarranted. The fact behind which we cannot go back is the diversity of the European Union and its monetary union. There will not be a federal mechanism that can account for all this diversity. It will lead to misuse, fraud, or at least it can easily be portrayed like this. And it's all not just a matter of communication, learning, information. I'm also saying this to Joris. You will have to find mechanisms at the sometimes subnational level. And this is, I find, the beauty of this new recovery fund, that it allows people to use it in their own way, of course, according to principles that hold people accountable for how they use it, but it is not a budget. I think it was one of the defining problems of the US that this much praised Hamiltonian moment, an extremely centralized vision of what this United States would be, immediately raised all alarm bells and has since then had a structuring conflict of states' rights versus the federal. We don't have that in the European Union, or even there, it's sometimes Brussels is too centralizing. And I think there is a tendency, because one thinks in holistic visions and so on. And I think that would be a problem. And if you try to implement this with a budget, an EU budget, it would spell the end of the EU very quickly. That's why I'm in favor of laboratory federalism, having mechanisms that create experiences, and on that, some learning. It's not a matter of communication.
Thank you very much. I'm now moving to another question, which is about the convention. This is something that I haven't heard for quite some time. The question is there any chance that the reform process will start with a convention? And does anyone believe that the framework for a convention is positive at the moment? I don't know, Chris, who would like to take this question on the convention?
I mean, I can quickly come into it, because I was following the convention rather closely in 2003 and 4. So the privilege of being old enough for that. But I think the Conference on the Future of Europe is one that tries to mimic this a little bit. But I mean, this question raises, of course, and the interesting point that the treaty change willingness to go down teaching change is limited, and which probably goes a bit in the direction of what Waltraud said, that the reality is that that member states are very cautious to open the treaty. So the reality is that maybe contrary to the 90s and 80s, where every 5 years we would have had a revision of the kind of treaty basis on which European integration worked, that this is not anymore the case. So since the Lisbon Treaty, since the failed convention and the failed constitutional moment, we have not had a willingness to reopen that. And that is a constraint. Now, the Conference of the Future of Europe is maybe deliberately one that is much more open in the sense of it doesn't pre-commit on a treaty change, but the kind of resistance you've seen vis-a-vis the idea of treaty change shows that we are constrained with those people and those member states that have, contrary to the convention, said, no, let's not go down this route.
Thanks very much. There is then another question, which is starts from a comment and the fact that basically the decision about the recovery package is incomplete. And if we really want to speak about solidarity, the starting point is not only the debt level, but also other aspects like tax pressure, level of public services. Would any of you like to react to this point? Waltraud?
I would just like to briefly say, I think this is a very well taken point, but I hope that it will come to the fore when we actually think about how the EU Commission now gets its own resources to pay or service the debt on this recovery fund, and then that will come up. And all these discussions, the earlier question about Netherlands tax haven status is something that I have already heard also from students in this 1 week where we even have not started, but in the welcome week. In other words, that seems to agitate people. And the Netherlands has brought that on itself with trying to, sit on the high horse at being so frugal. And now people look at what the basis of this frugality is. So we will be in for some very interesting debates on all that.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you a question from my side, maybe very quickly, and then so that we have the time for our last question. We talked about the lessons learned from the crisis, no? Whether these are incomplete and what can be used for this new crisis, which is different. But my question is, besides the lessons, are we better equipped to face a crisis now than we were 10 years ago, or not necessarily? And here I'm speaking both about mechanisms, but support, political situation in general. Quick reaction from who would like to start? No one?
I would make a very, very general, simple point, and that is I think that we understand much better than we did 10 years ago about how we're part of an interconnected world. And that, I think, makes it easier to explain to people why we need big solutions to big crises.
I think we are much better equipped. We have many more instruments, but as the ECB itself notices also, these instruments, if overused, can become part of the problem. And that is the case with the extraordinary monetary measures. And to be fair to the ECB, it has realized that and asked the fiscal authorities to come in, because otherwise you just throw more money at the problem and financial instability becomes again an own source of a very difficult recovery from this pandemic.
Thanks very much. There is then a question about the long-term policies and the time horizons of national politicians and national calendars. Is there anything that can be done in order to align priorities of politicians in the short term and let's say the national electoral cycles, and the idea of having long-term policies? That's a difficult one.
I personally think it's based on a few misperceptions. First of all, the elites have always short time horizons. I think voters have sometimes much shorter time horizons. If we think about what is tried to do about climate change, there are a few exceptions. But elites would like to go further than, say, the majorities that they have at the moment. The other thing is it's very difficult to coordinate electoral cycles. You would then probably have very quickly the problem of political budget cycles and electoral cycles and the fiscal policy targeting election dates if it's highly coordinated. This is why you don't have it in Germany, and it has high costs for campaigning and so on. But I would be careful about that.
Very last question, as we have just 1 minute. It has been noticed that no one mentioned the European semester. The question is, how does this new form of governance impact the notion of solidarity?
You mean, sorry, you mean how does Europe, new as in the European semester is new?
Yes.
Because we are now, in fact, currently in the Euroforums discussing how the semester will be different with the RRF coming in.
Yes.
So in fact, looking at the old European semester. But no, I mean, I think the European semester is, of course, a product of the last crisis, in the sense that we realized how to address that the imbalances had to be addressed. At the same time, it has not received the traction that in a way we would have hoped for. So I think the RRF now, with the mix between sort of positive fiscal incentives and hopefully a clear reform commitment, will bring a new dimension to it. And it will be very interesting at the beginning of next year when the Commission starts the review of the six-pack and two-pack, how to take this into account, and whether we could look at, on the one hand, the need to address imbalances, but at the same time to maybe come with new and more effective instruments, and how this will affect the way we are doing the European semester. So the review will be an important point to take stock, I find.
Thanks very much. We have reached the time limit, and I want to thank you all very much for your contribution and the active participation, and all the people who were listening to us. Thank you very much, and very good afternoon to all. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you for presenting your research. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for your comments.
Thanks.
Welcome.